Good evening, WW2TV fans. This is my first show with my new high-definition, top-of-the-range webcam. I'm noticing my eyes are slightly bluer, which is interesting. We're the only show we've got this week. We had the highs of Great Escape Week last week, and next week we've got some fascinating shows. We've got a show about Dirk Bogarde, show about Essel in the campaign to attack Germany. We've also got the show about Sam Fuller, the film director. But tonight, we're talking with Bryan Mark Rigg again, who, if you remember, was with us on Iwo Jima Week, and we're talking about his books that discuss the Germans who served the Third Reich, who were Jewish or part Jewish. So, good afternoon, Bryan. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. Thanks for having me again, Paul.
So, I tweeted that we were doing this show, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago, and people kind of misunderstood the title of it, because it is, when you say Hitler's Jewish soldiers, it kind of presents at first glance something of a paradox, because of course Hitler and the Third Reich are responsible for the deaths of millions. But the thing is, as you researched and other people have researched, the various classifications for Jewishness during the Nazi era kind of changed a bit. And so explain basically what their classifications were and how it ended up that there are different types of people who could be serving who were classified as Jewish.
Yeah, when you get underneath the hood of any society, it's not black and white, if you will. It's not just the Jews and not just the quote unquote Aryans like the Nazis were saying. You had hundreds of years of assimilation in Germany at this time when Hitler came into power. And you had intermixing for a long time, religiously and sociologically. So when Hitler came into power and he was saying Jews are bad, he was faced with how Jewish did you have to be bad? I mean, think about the classifications of what people were saying in America was black. I think some of the laws that were in Southern courts was if you were 1/16 black, you were black. I mean, Obama, if you look at his family tree from a little bit I've gathered, he has more Caucasian background than he has African American or African background. I mean, his father, who's African, supposedly had some Semitic background. So he actually was more white than he was anything else, yet everybody calls him black. He's not half white or half black. Everybody just calls him black. And you had something like this going on in Germany in 1933 when Hitler took power, and he'd been ranting for years that the Jews had done us in World War I. They're the downfall of Christian civilization. We got to get rid of them. And then when he finally got power, and they said, okay, his underlings, we can now go after the Jews, they were faced with, okay, how do you define a Jew? And they first came out with the Aryan paragraph in 1934 that basically just said if you had one grandparent that was a quote unquote non-Aryan, that you were then a non-Aryan yourself. And all these people were coming out of the woodwork who had a Jewish grandmother or grandfather that, had converted, 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. And they were creating chaos in the civil service, in the military, in the government, and even in the party. And also, Japan was very upset at this time, which was allied with Germany, because they were also classified as non-Aryans. And they didn't like this at all, and were putting pressure on the German government saying, you got to change this, because this is disgraceful. We don't want to be allied with a country that's calling us inferior. So Hitler got with his underlings again for the 1935 Nuremberg party rallies, and they started coming up with new laws. I mean, all the persecution that Germany implemented against gypsies and Jews and homosexuals and so on was always legally enforced. That's what's crazy about this time period. That's what gave it sanction, if you will. And Germans, being very rule-oriented, very obedient citizens, actually followed through with this in droves, and were in many respects very cowardly as far as being able to stand up and speak out against it. But that was just not part of the society at that time. So in 1935, the Nuremberg laws came out, and Hitler had new racial laws that dominated the society. And in these laws, you had what was classified as a German Aryan, if you will. And that was a person who had 4 Christian German grandparents. And then on the other extreme, you had what a Jew was. And a Jew was a person who either adhered to the Jewish religion or who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents. So if you're more than 50% Jewish, by race, if you will, then you were classified as a Jew. Or if you went to the synagogue and you had embraced the Jewish religion, you were Jewish. And then Hitler created 2 new legal fictions, if you will, and classified 2 new groups of people called the Quarter Jews, or Mischling of the second degree. Mischling is a horrible term. It means bastard, hybrid, or mutt. It's just used for dogs today that are crossbreed. Shows you what the Nazis thought of these people. And so a Mischling of the second degree was a quarter Jew, had 1 Jewish grandparent. And then a Mischling of the first degree was a half Jew or had 2 Jewish grandparents. And this created also a lot of chaos in German society. In fact, one of the most profitable professions to have at this time period was to be a genealogist, because everybody had to start carrying around not only your ID papers, your driver's license, your military passport, and your passport, but you also had an Ahnenpass, which was your ancestry passport book. And you had to carry this around. And you couldn't get married, you couldn't have certain jobs, you couldn't become, an officer if you didn't have, a kosher Aryan, family tree, if you will. And so this dominated the legal framework throughout the rest of the Third Reich of how you were going to classify society. Now, what's fascinating here is that for all the Nazi bogus talk, if you will, pseudoscience of talking about the Jews having unique blood or a big nose or flat feet or dark hair, they ultimately had to use religious criteria to define that race. Death certificates, birth certificates, marriage certificates throughout Germany for centuries always noted a person's religion involved. And as a result, the Nazis had to use these documents to define somebody's race instead of looking at all those other pseudoscience, scientific, phenotypical traits that I was just telling you about. So when this came out, what's ironic is that when the Wehrmacht, the German military, was looking at this, they started putting forward all these exemption packages for high-ranking officers and very prominent men who were in the military who were affected by these laws, saying, hey, these guys are Germans, they're Christians, they're blonde and blue-eyed, they don't look anything like Jews, and they're one of us. Their, quote-unquote Germanic blood is dominating them. And you actually had these proposals and packages going all the way up to Hitler, having a lot of lawyers help put it together and use the legal language with the pseudoscientific knowledge at the time being passed around about that you could literally really inherit all of your genetics from one parent or the other. So if you had a Jewish father and an Aryan, quote unquote, Germanic mother, you had people doing measurements of your skull, looking at your hair color, your eye color, and then saying, okay, he got everything from his Germanic mother, not his Jewish father, so he really is an Aryan and we can trust him. And then the Wehrmacht also said, hey, these half-Jews and quarter-Jews, there's thousands of them, and we just got the draft laws put in. We know how many men can be lost in one battle in World War I if we're going to really have a dominant military force. And if we are going to go to war later on, we need to have everybody we can. And, Hitler and his underlings came back and said, well, full Jews can't serve, but half Jews and quarter Jews, they're required to fulfill their draft obligations. And if they perform well while they're serving, we will give them certain exemptions that they can stay in the military and be promoted, or even be declared Germans, or be declared official Aryans, if you will. So this created a whole new legal world for German law at this time, and how you regulate all these different groups in society. And this is how all these guys, got into the military, and hence my title, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. Many of them were not in hiding. a lot of people thought, there were several that I found, obviously, that were Jews and in hiding. But by and large, most of these men were in the military because they were drafted. They had to serve. And the craziness is, while they're serving and getting the Iron Cross and so on, like you show in this picture right now, the guy that has the Iron Cross around his chest, Helmut Kruger, while he's wearing that Iron Cross right there, yeah, that guy right there, his mom's wearing a Jewish star. And so it just created sociological chaos in a schizophrenic world for many of these men while they were serving. And it's a really tragic chapter of the Third Reich in World War II.
It's tragic, but it's also sensitive. I mean, I remember as a tour guide in Normandy, and I've taken many, many people to La Combe and other German cemeteries here. And if we mention that some of the people buried there are Jewish, people get very defensive about, no, they're not. You go, well, it depends how you classify Jewish. It depends. But people don't want to accept, as we always have on these shows, the nuance of the situation. Everything has to be black and white. And the nuances back then, the irony is, Frank McDonough's book is amazing about this period as well, talking about, all the lawyers were involved in this, half of whom are Jewish as well, and the complications of that. And so, as you said there, you could marry into the Jewish faith and have complete Christian background, but you're Jewish, and someone else who is Jewish, but they've neglected their religion, they've forsaken it. It's just the rules and regulations are crazy, and all the. I'm glad you mentioned the complicity of the German legal system, because it doesn't get talked about enough. Judgment at Nuremberg is the film that I enjoy, where it looks into that. Burt Lancaster is a German judge, isn't he, being tried, and they look into that. Maximilian Schell, as the defense, as prosecution counsel, says, you were part of the process. You allowed these laws to change. You were there overseeing this regime come in, because it started in the courtrooms. It didn't. That's where it began. It wasn't always with the military. It was the courtrooms where these things became normal. But
yeah, I mean, Germans were more than willing later on to say, "Hey, I'm standing behind the law." And and even Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish leader of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment in Germany, and Reform Judaism, had actually even said in Germany that when a law becomes official, you have to obey it. And for many years, most laws in Germanic lands were very orderly about how to create order, how to create a good society, how to create good education. And then suddenly with Hitler, you have immoral, unethical laws becoming the official doctrine of how you regulate society, and it became mass chaos and evil. Now, another thing that needs to be brought out that's interesting about people saying, well, there weren't Jewish people in the German military. Another thing that creates a lot of confusion is when you look at Judaism and its own laws about its citizenship, which is called halakha, Jewish law. And so when I did my research, I ascertained that through assimilation records, birth rates, mixed marriage rates, conversion rates, as well as the draft numbers of these guys into the Wehrmacht, the German military, World War II, you have roughly a minimum of 60,000 half Jews and 90,000 quarter Jews that served in the German armed forces during World War II. Now, when you have over 17 million men who go to the ranks of the German military during World War II, this 1% doesn't seem that significant. But in light of the Holocaust, that 150,000 men of Jewish descent served in the Nazi military during World War II creates, a lot of interesting questions. And one of the interesting dilemmas that comes to light with this is when you're going back to Jewish law. According to halakha, especially for Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, conservative Jews, their definition of a Jew is a person who has a Jewish mother. So by that definition, I found that well over 60% of all the half Jews that I documented had Jewish mothers. And I found around, about 25 to 30% of the quarter Jews had mothers whose mother was Jewish. So according to Jewish law, these men were full Jews. I mean, the guy who we'll be talking about here shortly, the father of Blitzkrieg, Helmut Wilberg, had a Jewish mother. So according to Jewish law, he would be considered a full Jew. So, you know, the Jews have their own citizenship laws, and Reform Judaism and Reconstruction Judaism has done away with that and said, you know, this is not, you know, something that we embrace, and it's discriminatory. You know, you can get just as much of your identity from your mother as you can from your father. So, you know, in light of the Holocaust, you got to use the Nuremberg laws to really understand this history, because it defined the reality. But you can't be ignorant about what Jews think about themselves, especially religious Jews, because it creates a lot of chaos when you look at this. Hold on one second.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So thanks for joining us. And for those who are watching this, it's an interesting, nuanced subject that I think requires a bit of examination. And it is extraordinarily complex, this. And, you know, there's a conversation with someone asked us when about the vaccine pass. I don't want to go into modern politics, but there is something where we'll be asked to prove something about ourselves in order to travel. I don't think there's a particular parallel between this and what the Nazis do.
I wouldn't at all. I mean, you know, back then it's all about your quote unquote blood and race, and it was to discriminate against you. Now with the vaccine, we're trying to just protect people from getting sick, and if you don't take your responsibility, I mean, like, you know, parents not getting, you know, their kids, you know, the mumps vaccine and things of that sort. You know, there's a lot of things that are socially responsible things that you do in society. So I don't think there's any parallel there. I agree with you on that one.
But before we leap into some of the Germans you wrote about, how did you go about this research? And did you, at the point of researching things, feel at any point you were sort of treading on toes or going into areas that people didn't want you to go? How did the process go for you?
Well, when I started this, you know, I didn't actively start this research by thinking about it and doing it. It just kind of picked me out of the heavens, if you will. It was Schicksal, to use the German word, destiny. I was over in Germany in 1992 to research my family's background and learn the language of my ancestors. And while I was over there, I was at the Goethe Institute in Berlin learning the German language. And one of my instructors, after a while, I was talking with him, and I said, you know, what movie should I watch to improve my German? And he said, well, why don't you, you know, what are you interested in? And I said, World War II and the Holocaust. He says, well, why don't you go see that film that just came out called Europa, Europa? In German, it's called Ich war Hitler Jungen Solomon. I was the Hitler Youth called Solomon. And so I bought my ticket, went to the Berlin Theater in the middle of the city, went into an empty auditorium and was waiting for the film to begin. And as I was waiting for the film to start, the doors opened up behind me, and I was the only person in this auditorium. And I turned to see that this old man walked in, and his eyes had not adjusted to the darkness. He was a little discombobulated with his surroundings. And when he leaned up against the wall, because he was obviously unsure of his footing, with my good Texas upbringing, I went up to him, asked him if I could help him find a seat. He's very appreciative. I sat him next to me, and we started watching the film. And he was translating the dialogue and giving commentary. Now, the film Europa, Europa is about Shlomo Perel, a German Jew who in 1936 leaves Germany because of the persecution and goes to Poland. In 1939, when Germany invades Poland, he and his brother escape to Russia. In 1941, when Germany invades Russia, he is no longer able to escape. He's taken prisoner outside of the city of Minsk. And during his interrogation, he emphatically denied that he was Jewish, and he told the interrogators that he was a Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German instead. And since he could speak Polish, Russian, and German, although he was 14 years old at the time, they actually took him into the unit as their Dolmetscher, their translator, and he served 1 year with this combat unit. And then at the end of the year, his Captain von Munchau, decides to adopt him, of all things, and sends him back to Germany to a Hitler Youth prep school. And that's how he survived the war. Now, after this film, I asked this elderly gentleman next to me what he thought of the film. His name was Peter Milius. And he said, wait, the history is very close to my own history. Would you like to go talk? And I said, sure. So we went to a bar where he told me his story for the entire evening. He was of Jewish descent. had served 4 years in the Wehrmacht and then was taken prisoner by the Russians at the end of the war and served 5 years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp, survived, came back, and became a physics teacher in high school in Hamburg. And I was talking to him, and during this conversation that night, I was like, man, that's what are the coincidences that I go to this film about a Jew who served in the Nazi military only to sit next to a Wehrmacht veteran of Jewish descent. And I wondered if there were more people like this. So when I returned to Yale University for my sophomore year, I began to ask a lot of my professors about looking into this. And many of them were extremely negative, saying I wouldn't find anything. But when I found out that none of them, like Henry Turner, a famous German historian and one of my mentors who eventually helped me tremendously, when I found out that none of them had looked into this subject matter and they didn't know anybody who had looked into it, I decided to explore it. I didn't think this was, a random coincidence of what happened to me. And slowly but surely, I started finding more of these guys. And by the end of my junior year, I decided to take off a year between my junior and senior year and try to interview as many of these people that I possibly could in order to gather research to write a very good senior essay to end my time at Yale University. I had documented 20 guys up to this point. This was in 1994, 7 of whom were still alive, and I wanted to go interview them. And I was hoping if I could interview around 30 or 40 guys in 1 year, I could write a good senior essay, maybe get a Fulbright or a Rhodes or a Marshall and continue on doing some more graduate studies and end my career at Yale with a lot of dignity and with original research. Well, when I went over to Germany and started researching this and interviewing these guys, it was like a snowball effect. My professor at Cambridge University, Jonathan Steinberg, called me the sorcerer's apprentice. Once I called up all these sources, so to speak, I couldn't stop the flood of research that was coming to me. And by the end of that year that I had taken off between my junior and senior year in 1995, I had interviewed over 200 men and collected over 10,000 pages of documents. And I was getting helmets and Lugers and daggers and medals and diaries and you name it. And so I came back to Yale in 1995 with a lot of momentum for my senior year, and then just continued on building that out. I got what is the equivalent of like the Rhodes Scholarship for Harvard and Yale. It's called the Henry Fellowship, and continued on my graduate studies at Cambridge under Jonathan Steinberg, and just kind of built out my own archive, if you will. And slowly but surely, a lot of professors at the beginning, like I said, were very negative. I didn't think I was going to find anything, but slowly but surely, they started coming on board. Paula Hyman at Yale University, head of Judaic Studies, was an incredible support and helped me out. And then later on, Michael Barabaum, been a wonderful mentor of mine for decades now. He came on board, helped me, supported me, was very kind. And so it just kind of took the research and the support, just took on a life of its own. And it, went from a senior essay to a master's to a PhD to now, 4 published books.
Yeah. I mean, and yeah, the work you've done is incredible. But let's leap in and talk about some of the people. And I think we'll start with the one you just mentioned, because we'll start with some of the people that perhaps the audience will know. So yeah, one of the fathers of the Blitzkrieg. So yeah, Helmut Wilberg.
So this guy,
to me, he's kind of, I'll let you talk, but he's kind of the symbol of the whole paradox and the illogical nature of what's going on in the Third Reich. Is that, he's part of it, and Hitler keeps changing his mind. But tell us his story.
So Helmut Wilberg was a brilliant mind. There should be more written about him. I have played around for a long time of writing his biography, but unfortunately, his Berlin apartment during World War II got bombed, and all his personal papers were burned. And he died in an aircraft accident in 1941. So, we were not able to get his depositions, if you will, and his autobiography after the war. But this guy was brilliant. He was a very humane man. He was a very good father. He was a hardworking officer. He was one of the first guys to get a pilot's license on the Wright brother plane. Many people were dying getting that license, but he was able to push through and learn how to fly. In World War I, this guy was the first guy to start coordinating attacks on the Western Front in 1917 with airplanes, tanks, artillery, and infantry. The foundation of blitzkrieg, if you will, coordinated attacks, combined arms, maneuver warfare. You look at this rack. He basically has the equivalent of the United States Medal of Honor, or in Britain the Victoria Cross. He had the Silver Star, the Bronze Star. You see his Iron Cross First Class there, right below that rack. And he got so many medals and decorations from other militaries just for his brilliance. He was also the first guy to start using radios and planes in World War I to coordinate attacks with guys on the ground. And a very ingenious way of using this technology that wasn't even being used by the Russians and the French at the beginning of World War II, just to show you his vision. Now, after the war ended in World War I, 1918, German military obviously was, basically truncated down to about 100,000 guys. And he was kept on, and he was basically studying and writing and trying to figure out what's the best way to fight the future war. Well, it's definitely not static. It's definitely not trench warfare. That's horrible. We got to figure out how to bypass these lines, how to hit the enemy from behind, outflank them, and hit them with quick and fast, basically power thrust into different centers of gravity, Schwerpunkts. Whether that be a city, whether that be the military command structure, whether that be their supply lines, and so on. And he started developing what later became Regulation 16, which is the foundation of blitzkrieg. He was the commander of the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, which basically laid the foundation for how Germans would later on conduct their blitzkrieg in Poland and France and Russia. He's just a brilliant mind. And in many respects, without this guy, I mean, he had a lot of other people working with him. Don't get me wrong. Guderian was there helping out. Rommel was thinking about things. I mean, the German military brain trust militarily at this time was amazing. Von Manstein and so on. But he was one of the prime movers of how you coordinate the Luftwaffe with the army and hit fast and quickly. And his fingerprints are all over the success that the Wehrmacht had from 39 to 41. Going to Mulder's funeral in 1941, his plane, the wings froze up and fell out of the sky, and he died. He lost several relatives in the Holocaust, and it would have been very interesting what would have happened to him had he survived. I mean, he had problems in the 30s with his Jewish background. He had a Jewish mother. He was kicked out of the military, but then right before the war started off in Poland, he was reactivated again. And he had several meetings with Hitler. There was one diary that did survive that the family gave me that I was able to look through. And, during these meetings he had with Hitler, on one side, he was absolutely fascinated with the man and his vision and how he held power. And on the other side, he's like, all this racial nonsense, it's getting in the way of Germany becoming powerful. So he is a huge dichotomy. And it's sad that all his brilliance was used for an evil regime. But, a lot of people don't know about Helmut Wilberg, but he's one of the most famous generals, not only of Germany, but really of military history, and should be studied a lot more.
Yeah, and as you were saying that about the fact he had family members who were killed in the Holocaust, is the questions come up from other viewers about generally with these 200 people you interviewed, if they are surviving by serving the Third Reich in some capacity, but they have relatives who are being, we know what happened to them. Did they ever talk about that to you? Did they ever feel guilt? How did their moral compass go in this case? Were they happy? Obviously they were happy they weren't being swept up in it, but how did those subjects come up in your conversations?
Yeah, well, I actually interviewed over 400 by the end of it all, from 1994 to 1998. And what you find is it was very difficult to know about the Holocaust as we know it today. Yeah. One book that people need to read if they really want to study this is called The Twisted Road to Auschwitz by Karl Schloss. It's a classic work showing how the evolution of slaughtering the Jews, even though in Mein Kampf, when Hitler brought that out in the 20s, he talks about, we got to get rid of the Jews, and the Jews are bad. And if you look at the Jew that he's really looking at, it's the communist Jew, of Karl Marx, or it's the ultra Orthodox who don't serve and just want to study all day. In fact, when I was in the Israeli military before I started in the Marine Corps, when my Rasap, my drill sergeant, found out about my research and what I was doing, he basically said, the ultra Orthodox are horrible. They don't serve here in Israel. They live off the dole welfare. They can vote, but they don't want to serve in the military. And I'll never forget him spitting on the ground and saying, if Hitler had killed all those ultra Orthodox, this world would be a better place. And I was just shocked that my Israeli, drill sergeant was saying this. But this was the hatred back in 1933 and 34 when Hitler came into power. It was against communism, and it was against the ultra Orthodox. Now, what you have to remember is that after World War I, there was massive civil war all throughout Germany. From 1918 to 1919, thousands of people are dying in the streets, and it's between the communists, the Spartacus groups, the Reds, and the Freikorps, the nationalists, trying to keep Germany away from becoming a communist nation. And Hitler remembered this and saw it and was just horrified that his country was split up, having civil war everywhere. So later on, when he's speaking to the German nation, we got to get rid of the Jews and they're horrible. A lot of Germans are thinking, well, he's talking about those ultra-Orthodox Jews that are in the East, Russia and Poland, who don't serve and they study all day and they're not very patriotic. They don't care about the countries they live in. Or he's talking about the guys who are the communists that create moral chaos. So we want to get rid of those people. But, the people that are in German society who are assimilated, they never really thought this was going to come on them. So a lot of these people, getting back to this question of the viewer of why didn't they do more, or how did they feel? Well, most of them really didn't understand what was going on. And you have to realize the Holocaust, as we understand it today, really didn't take flight, if you will, until the invasion of Russia of June 22nd, 1941. That's when you have a huge push of starting to kill the Jews. I mean, more Jews died in the first month and a half of invasion of Russia than in the subsequent 8 years under Nazi rule. Now, you did have Kristallnacht, you had the boycott, Jewish boycotts, you had people arrested, people sent to Dachau and Sachsenhausen, and so on. But as far as systematic extermination, that really wasn't going on and really starting to be planned until 41 and 42, with the famous Wannsee conference with Heydrich and Eichmann. Yep. And so, the twisted road to Auschwitz was really a labyrinth before you finally get to Sobibor and Majdanek and Auschwitz. Now, so getting to these men, as these guys like Wilberg that I just showed are serving in the 30s and whatnot, they're also in the back of their mind, they're like, hey, during the Weimar Republic, every 6 months we had a new government. Hitler has a lot of good ideas about, having a strong military, a strong government, having the Autobahn, cancer research, having everybody serve their nation. And everybody really liked this, and they were supportive of it. But there wasn't a lot of talk at this time. We're going to take the Jews to Auschwitz and we're going to kill them by gassing them first and then turning them into ash within 24 hours. This was not publicly discussed. And Hitler had these death camps outside of German proper for fear of having the population rise up against us and not wanting it. So a lot of these guys who are serving, they're thinking, hey, the Weimar Republic, we had a government every 6 or 7 months. Hitler doing a lot of good stuff, but eventually he's going to go away and we'll have a new government. And finally, we'll have some people that are rational here. And they'll keep on focusing on the good stuff he's doing, and then they'll throw away all that anti-Semitic nonsense that he's doing. Well, little did they know that as soon as he got in, he had the enabling law, and he started, banning political parties that were against the Nazis. He had a treaty with the Vatican, the first sovereign state he had a treaty with was with the Vatican, the Reichsconcordant of July 1933. which the Pope legitimized Hitler in the eyes of Catholics all over the place and neutered the only party really who could fight against him, the Catholic Party. And so as Hitler started legally banning all his competition and then creating laws to give him carte blanche in anything he wanted to do, before they knew it, they didn't have the ability to have free elections or new governments and whatnot. But they still didn't think it was going to get that bad. And one of the most shocking things I found with a lot of these guys is that in 40 and 41 and 42, a lot of these guys are creating chaos with the bureaucracy, because as they're serving, getting the Iron Crosses and fighting well, and then their parents and grandparents are being persecuted, they're coming back home and going to the authorities and saying, hey, you can't persecute my Jewish mother. I'm in charge of 8 tanks on the Russian front. I got the Iron Cross. You got to protect my family. What are you doing? And this created a lot of problems. And Hitler basically said in 1940, he said, hey, we're either going to have to protect all the Jewish parents of half-Jewish soldiers, or we're going to have to discharge the half-Jews. Well, we can't protect full Jews. Discharge the half-Jews. And so there was these massive discharges of thousands of half-Jews here and there, depending on how the bureaucracy was done. I mean, think about it. 17 million men went to the ranks, over 17 million men went to the ranks of the Wehrmacht. So you had to do ancestry research on not only their parents too, but their 4 grandparents. So you had to do documentation on millions of people to make sure your soldiers were quote unquote kosher Aryans to be able to go fight. Well, a lot of these guys are slowly but surely found, and from 40 to 42 especially, there's tens of thousands of them dismissed. And then in 1944, Hitler said, hey, we need to use this valuable pool of manpower as the war started turning against him. And they started sending these guys to forced labor camps. Now, one of the interesting questions I asked a lot of these men and looked at the documentation is that, hey, and on average, every man I documented, German soldier, lost between 6 and 7 relatives in the Holocaust. And most of these relatives had been killed before they were being sent off to their own forced labor camps in 1944. So I asked them, I said, hey, why did you go to your forced labor camps if you knew about your relatives? Well, most of them said, I didn't know about my relatives. I mean, I knew some of them were disappearing, some of them were going to camps, but I had no knowledge of that they were being systematically exterminated, that, the people I grew up with and my neighbors and my teachers and the bureaucracy that I was, I knew a lot of the mayors and the senators and, and the local officials. I couldn't believe that they would be killing my relatives. So when many of these guys were called up to go to their own forced labor camps and be deported, most of them went. Now, you would think, had they known that their relatives who were deported before them had been deported to their own systematic extermination, most of these guys who had been trained as soldiers would have done everything they could have to have gotten to Sweden or Switzerland or gone underground, or at least taken a pistol with them if they had it, and try to kill as many people as they could once they got to these camps. And many of them had weeks, if not a month, to report to their deportation stations. They got notices in the mail quite often by the labor offices or the Gestapo to report at this time, at this place. And so only when most of them did. This is just what's mind-numbing to me. But once they got to their forced labor camps, and forced labor camps under the Organisation Tod, the organization Tod was what was the name of these camps that were under this organization. Only when they got to the camps did they realize, oh my God, now I know what happened to my aunt or my grandmother or my mom. And these camps were very different than concentration camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. And they were very different from the death camps, so like Majdanek and Sobibor and Auschwitz. So there were several generations removed from the persecution. But when they got there, then they kind of realized what was going on. But luckily for most of them, the war was coming to an end anyway. They were only there for a few months. And as a percentage, they survived at a higher percentage than their relatives, obviously. And what's also ironic here is many of these guys had been dismissed really before Russia happened, or, right during the time of the glory days in Russia. And so they came home and they studied and worked for several years until they were deported to forced labor camps, while their quote unquote Aryan comrades had the honor to go to Russia and continue on fighting. and most of them died. So as a percentage-wise, half Jews survived at a higher percentage than full Jews who went to the camps, and their Aryan comrades, their schoolmates that had to fight 4 years in Russia. Most of them are pushing up daisies in the Russian fields right now.
There's a lot of bizarreness about this whole story, and the paradoxes of it all. And I also think we ought to just stress, of course, that when we're looking back at these events with the benefit of hindsight, we're talking about an organization, a Reich that was controlled by fear and the power of propaganda as well. You know, we have all the information now. We're seeing a full deck. Anybody living under the Third Reich was only seeing part of the deck, and they're only seeing the part that Joseph Goebbels was allowing them to see. So we're able to see now with complete vision the complexity and of the evil that was going on at that time. As we know, everyone didn't know the whole picture. So let's get back to some of the people we talked about. And this is the one.
Now, on that point, before we bring up the next person, on that point, I have to reiterate to people that, in today's age, especially when we've grown up in democracies, the great gift that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson gave us is the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. And that secures our democracy. And so a lot of times people are projecting their understanding of how society is today on these Germans that were, that they didn't have iPads, they didn't have a TV, they weren't getting real information in real time. Real information. I mean, it was all propaganda by Goebbels. And then even when it was coming, it was several days late if it was describing some aspects of truth about Stalingrad and so on. So, and most of these guys are fairly young. I mean, some of the high-ranking officers, you can't give them a hall pass like a lot of these young men that I documented. But, out of the 400 men that I documented, most of them were between the ages of 18 and 25 when they were serving, and their world reality was very small. I mean, they're thinking, hey, when can I sleep with the next girl? When can I drink some beer and be back home with my family? How do I not get shot? When can I sleep with the next girl? And, how do I get some leave? I mean, their reality was very small. And in the inputs they were getting about the persecution, especially when they were brutalized on the Russian front, they couldn't really put it into context at that time. Only after the war did they start to realize what's going on. I mean, one story that's just horrifying to me is I was interviewing this man, and he was talking about how he had false documents. He was a half Jew. He had false documents, so he was on the Russian front serving as a soldier the whole time. He had married a Jewish woman, and under the German laws, it was a privileged mixed marriage, and they had a little boy. And in 1942, he gets this notice that she's deported with their son to a camp called Auschwitz. And he thinks to himself, who deports a nursing mother to a forced labor camp? He's thinking it's something that put all these Jews here to work and help the Reich. So he gets emergency leave from his officer, goes back to Berlin, tries to get to the camp. If he really knew what was going on in Auschwitz, why was he trying to get there? Obviously, he's denied. Goes back to his unit. Later on in 1944, it's transferred to the Western Front. He's fighting the Americans, taken prisoner. And at the end of the war, with the Nuremberg trials coming out, he eventually realizes that his a wife and baby boy were immediately killed when they were, sent to Auschwitz. They were immediately gassed, and within 24 hours, they were up the chimneys there in, crematorium 2, 3, 4, or 5. So as he's talking to me, he's breaking down, and me with my, etiquette in America, when you see somebody breaking down and having an emotional time with the subject matter, you show them some human kindness. Germans are not usually used to, hugs and whatnot, but I did turn off my camera. I went up to him, I gave him a hug, and I told him, hey, if you want to take some time and, maybe I'll come back tomorrow, I can do so. Or if you want to go out and we'll walk around for a while, we can do that. And as I back away from him, I look over at his wife, and she is fuming. She is really angry. And I'm thinking maybe she's upset that I brought him to this emotional state. Possibly he's upset that, I've asked him such direct questions. But I quickly realized that she's not upset at me. She's upset at him because this is the first time in 60 years she's found out she's the second wife.
Oh, right.
And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, hey, I'll just leave you two alone for a while. But this story just shows you a lot of these guys didn't really understand what was going on, and that this guy actually was trying to get to the camp shows you just how ignorant he was of the reality that was facing the Jewish population at that time.
Mm.
So,
and maybe because you said about the documentation there, a good time to answer the question from Tim O'Brien there. Did you ever find evidence of falsified ancestry passports for German soldiers? I mean, you just said the guy you talked to there had a false documentation, so obviously it was something you found. So,
oh yeah, left and right guys are trying to falsify the documentation. I mean, one guy we'll talk about here, Erhard Milch, a field marshal, a 5-star general in the Luftwaffe here. You know, his mother and many mothers tried to do this. Most were unsuccessful, but his mother was. She went to Goering and went to other Nazi officials and said, "Hey, my Jewish husband, Anton Milk, is not the father of my 6 children. It's my uncle, who, by the way, is also dead." Well, they did a lot of research by taking hair samples of the kids, skull measurements, and depositions and whatnot. And eventually they came to the conclusion that all 6 of her children were indeed sired by the uncle and were they're declared Aryan. So, you know, in this respect, we see that, you know, Jewish ancestry was horrible during the Third Reich, but incest was okay. But a lot of guys were doing this. And there's another story of this guy that he goes to his mom. He says, "Mom, you know, just lie about who you slept with and say it's not my dad." And so she goes to the authorities and says, "Hey, the Jewish, you know, guy that's put down as the father of my son is not really the father. It's this Aryan lover I had." They actually found the Aryan guy. He had courted her before. He did sign affidavits that they had an affair and sired the son. He now is classified no longer as a half Jew. He's classified as an Aryan. He's able to go back to his unit now, which he wanted to do. And in the first week of the invasion of Russia, he's killed. You know, so you have a lot of these guys that are falsifying their documents, doing everything they can to try to get a new identity. So yes, you know, I saw Tim O'Brien ask that. He's one of my favorite cousins, so it was nice to hear that he's listening. But yeah, that's right. Many of these people did get false documentation. Now, Milch, as you show here,
I put the image in from the Battle of Britain because some people will remember that he was portrayed in the Battle of Britain.
Yeah, he was. I mean, the guy was brilliant. He ran Lufthansa back in the Weimar Republic. He was a brilliant guy when it came to logistics. He also was brilliant with encouraging technology and innovation. He saved, in many respects, the campaign in Norway, especially up at Narvik, by bringing supplies up there. He got the Iron Cross, the Knight's Cross for that you see hanging around his neck. And then later on, after the defeat of France and how quickly France was defeated using the Luftwaffe, Milch was one of only a few guys that was declared a field marshal, a 5-star general. In fact, by 1944, he ranked 7th among Hitler's subordinates. And he was a ruthless bureaucrat, power-hungry, a nasty, nasty human being. But you know, he's one case where false documentation allowed him to remain in the military. And a lot of people say that Goering, when he said, "Wer ist Jude, bestimme ich," you know, who and who is not a Jew, I'll decide, he was quite often referring to Milch, who was, for all intents and purposes, he ran the Luftwaffe. Goering did not. So this guy was a fascinating case study and a horrible, horrible human being.
I mean, the diversity of people you write about, from the very worst of the people supporting the Reich to the innocents the other end. I mean, it's they're like any other sub part of society. There's all types within that, isn't it? So the German Jews who served, they're doing in all sorts of capacities and all sorts of levels of commitment, shall we say. But I think my favorite of the stories you wrote about is this gentleman here, and I'll show you your slide in a minute because that is such a famous image, isn't it?
Yeah,
it became famous.
Yeah, Werner Goldberg. I mean, he was a wonderful gentleman and became a dear friend of mine. I spent many an evening having Abendbrot, you know, evening bread and cheese with him, and having a white German wine. So Werner Goldberg in 1939, he was serving in a unit outside of Berlin, and Goebbels had sent out a message to a lot of the battalions in the area saying, hey, give me your most Aryan-looking soldier. We want to do some pictures and use them in the propaganda films I'm doing and the photographs and pamphlets that I want to send out. So Werner Goldberg won the competition, and for about 4 months, he was paraded around in pamphlets and whatnot as the typical Aryan soldier until they found out that his father was Jewish. It just is another example of how these racial laws Hitler had didn't meet up with reality. I mean, a lot of the guys I interviewed were blonde and blue-eyed, were put at the front of their classes quite often in biology, saying this is a typical Aryan guy. And it just shows you how bankrupt the Nazi racial laws were. Now, what's also fascinating about Werner Goldberg is in 1943, there was a famous protest that happened in Berlin. It's called the Rosenstrasse protest. And a good colleague of mine, a dear person to me, and I find him fascinating. He's a great historian, Nathan Stoltzfus. He wrote about this protest because in 1943, a lot of Jews were taken away from their Aryan, quote unquote, Aryan wives and were going to be deported to Auschwitz. And it was violating the laws at the time that the privileged mixed marriages, when you were married to somebody and you were Jewish, you had some protection. Suddenly that was going away. Goering and the Gestapo arrested hundreds and hundreds of these Jewish men that were living in Berlin at the time. And their wives and soldier sons, to the tune of a few thousand sometimes, started protesting outside of the jail house where these men were being, incarcerated before their deportation. And the Nazis eventually released them. It shows that the Nazis were sensitive to social unrest when these men knew something was going on. And they didn't know exactly they're going to go straight to their deportation, to death, but they knew it wasn't going to be good. And they protested and they demanded, their men. In fact, the chant that the women, these brave, German Christian women, were saying, give us back our men, give us back our men. I mean, it brings tears to your eyes about the courage that this took. And Werner was right there saying, give me back my dad. So this is the tragedy here, that many of these men were serving in the military and serving a nation that they thought were going to honor them. And obviously they were persecuting them. And eventually, had Hitler won the war, Werner Goldberg would have been slaughtered as well, because once you kill the parents of these guys, you can't have Jewish children running around. But what's also interesting to help people understand the psychology of people like Werner Goldberg is that most of these guys I documented, when they're serving, they're saying, hey, I'm not doing anything different than my Jewish fathers and uncles and grandfathers have done since the Franco-Prussian War. In World War I, 100,000 German Jews served Germany. 12,000 of them died. In Austrian-Hungarian Empire, 300,000 Jews served that country's military, or that empire's military, and 25,000 of them died. More Jews died for Austria and Germany in World War I than all Israeli conflicts to date. So these men came from strong military traditions, and they thought, hey, if I serve well, it's going to protect my family, and we're going to get back to normal citizenship. And I'm doing nothing different than what my Jewish ancestors had done to fight for this nation.
Yeah, the whole thing, the words that keep going through my brain are paradox and
tragic
and irony and tragedy and this, I don't want to use the word stupid, but how just ridiculous these laws were, and yet it results in tragedy. I mean, it is. Yeah, we'll move on a bit because time is. I mean, I'm finding it fascinating, as are the viewers. But that's the image you talked about right at the beginning there, because you can just see that image on the front of Signal or one of the German propaganda magazines. It's just got that look about it, and yet another one with an interesting past.
Yeah, well, Helmut Kruger, a lot of the tragedy of a lot of these guys is exemplified by Helmut Kruger here, who is also a dear friend. I spent many an evening with him in Berlin talking about this history. Both Werner and Helmut proofread my book, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, before it was published. And they were just great, great friends. In fact, when Helmut was on his deathbed, I called him up. I was like, man, I don't like this. I'm not going to be able to have Abendbrot with you anymore and talk to you. And he'd become a really dear friend. And he's like, well, what do you, expect, you putz? He says, when you make friends with 80-year-old men, they're going to die on you, you know? But he had no fear. He did what a lot of men did in his situation. They were thinking, hey, not only if I serve will I be able to protect my Jewish mother in this case, but if I go on special missions and volunteer for the most dangerous operations, it will really protect my family. And he did that in France and was very brave. That's why he got the Iron Cross second class that you see on his uniform right now. And what's tragic about him is that his mother was arrested. She was no longer, the mother decided to get a divorce from the father, thinking that would help the family because the father continued to get fired from his jobs because he was married to a Jewish woman. So she said, hey, let's get a divorce, and then this will allow you to work. We'll still live together. We love each other. There was a wonderful union. And what happened when they did that is that the protection of a privileged mixed marriage went away, and she was free game to be latched on by the German legal system and deported. So in 43, she is arrested, and Answald, who was Helmut's brother, was also in the military. They had both been dismissed by now because they were half Jews with that order that Hitler gave. And this is in 43. But they have their medals, and I think they even put back on their uniforms when she was arrested and about to be deported to Theresienstadt. And they're protesting. You cannot do this. They even went to a couple of the SS guys and were showing, both of them had the Iron Cross second class. And they're like, look, we served this nation. We bled for this nation. You cannot deport this woman. And do you have an Iron Cross? And the SS guy was like, hey, man, comrade, I understand where you're coming from. I'll see what I can do. And they'll never forget that, the face, she was able to look out of this prison, out of the window at her sons just crying as they're begging for her. She does get deported to Theresienstadt. Thank God she survived, but her health was shattered after the war. And she died a few years later from all the hardships that she had. But Helmut Kruger is just another example. I mean, these guys were patriotic Germans, but on the other side, they were abused, and it was a horrific schizophrenic situation that they were in that, I really hopefully bring out in my book. And you have a lot of sympathy for these men. I mean, at first, when you hear Hitler's Jewish soldiers, you're thinking, traitors, how could they do this? And they had to know about the Holocaust, yet they were able to continue on doing what they did and turn a blind eye to their parents. No, these guys, many of them were extremely moral within the framework of what they could do. They were incredible human beings, and you take inspiration from what they did, and your heart bleeds for the situations they were in.
And it wasn't easy. It wasn't black and white. We get that in France all the time. That people are either brave resistance workers or they're collaborators, and you go, well, no, that's only the two extremes. In the middle is just trying to survive, and this is what these stories are. People going and they take a path and they think, well, this is going to be the path that will protect my family the best. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, they said, well, it was the wrong path to take. But at the time, they're making a decision based on the limited information they have, based on things that we now know were false. But at the time, you can't always question why they did these things. And excuse me for jumping in here, Paul, but you bring up, a lot of these guys are dealing with choiceless choice. Yeah.
I mean, they can't go to the draft board and say, hey, I feel Jewish, I don't want to serve. They'd be shot. And then after, they get dismissed, they can't say, hey, I don't like what the government's doing. I'm going to go support another candidate to go against Adolf Hitler. I mean, these guys, they're dealing with limited opportunities. And to use Lawrence Longer's phrase, he wrote a wonderful book called Holocaust Testimonies. Many of these guys were dealing with the phraseology of choiceless choice. And even within that framework, you do get some heroic behavior, but by and large, they didn't have very many options open to them. And so it brings up a lot of questions, what's a Nazi? Are these guys, are they a Jew or are they a German? Are they a victim or a perpetrator? Were they worthy to live or were they not to live? Did they behave heroically or not heroically? How much did they know? How much should they have known? I mean, Gert Falkenheim, another guy I interviewed, he said, I don't feel guilty what I did do. I was drafted. I had to serve. I would have been shot as a deserter if I tried to go away from my unit. But I do feel guilty for what I didn't do. I should have recognized what was going on and take my aunt and my grandmother and got them to Switzerland or Sweden or got them false documents. I should have done this and should have done this and should have done that. I should have understood what it was, being imparted to me by the inputs in society, but I just didn't understand at the time. So I feel guilty for what I didn't do, which is sad.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about this because this came up with requests on the chat there. But I guess like my status now, I'm English, British, European. I live in France. I have different hats metaphorically that I define myself for certain purposes. It's very complex. I mean, but on DNA tests now, haven't we? We all know we're mongrels. We all come from all over the place. And what is my identity? What is Britishness? What is being Germanic? What do any of these things actually mean? It's all labels, isn't it? It's semantics and labels.
Yeah, but but the craziness for a lot of these men with everything that you just labeled, if I came up to you and took your passport and said, no, you're not a Brit.
Yeah.
And no, you're not Caucasian. No, you're not, an ethical humanist or a Protestant or of the Church of England. You are a subhuman, non-Aryan. You're like, no. Wait a second. No, I'm British. No, you're not. And so these guys are dealing with a whole new reality where suddenly they're hyphenated humanity and subhuman. And so you bring up this picture of Bloch, and people ask me, did guys actually rescue Jews? And many of them did. And the most famous rescue mission that I documented, and Michael Barabaum, who's one of the founders of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and my wonderful mentor and dear friend, has basically told me this is probably the most remarkable rescue of World War II, even more remarkable in many respects of Schindler's List. And what happened was in 1939, Germany still had diplomatic relations with America. And when Germany invaded Poland, a lot of Jews of this arch leader, you see him, Rebbe Schneerson, with the big beard on the book, and he's the one sitting down here to the right. He was basically the Jewish Pope of Europe at this time, and many of his followers said to America, "You got to rescue him. You got to get him out." He had the good fortune of meeting Louis Brandeis, Senator Robert Wagner, Benjamin Cohen, who was in the brain trust of FDR and basically wrote up the New Deal legislation. And many of these guys went to FDR and people in the State Department said, "Hey, we got to rescue this guy. He's going to help us with the Jewish vote." And we're getting a lot of pressure from a lot of diplomats and politicians. So they decided to act on it. And some of the guys in our government had contact with the head of the Secret Service, Admiral Canaris, the Abwehr. And Canaris decided to help America rescue this guy. And he basically ordered his trusted underling, Ernst Bloch, who you see here, to go rescue the Rebbe. Now, Ernst Bloch, the reason why he has a horribly disfigured face is because in World War I, he took a bayonet up through his jaw and into his mouth, dividing his face vertically. Almost died from it, had the equivalent of 5 Purple Hearts, and had the Iron Cross first and second class, and also had a PhD in economics and was head of the economic espionage division. And he had been Aryanized by Hitler because he was a quote-unquote half Jew. And he had a couple underlings underneath him who were also half and quarter Jewish. One spoke Yiddish because his Jewish grandfather taught him that, had been a rabbi. And he went up and eventually convinced this guy, Rebbe Schneerson was his name, the leader of Chabad, to trust him. And through this rescue action, you get him to America eventually, and now the largest Hasidic ultra-Orthodox community in the world is based out of Brooklyn, New York. And the only reason why it happened is because a Nazi officer who was Jewish was able to find him, convince him of his mission, and rescue him. And not only do you have the rescue of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe, but you have the rescue of the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, who is basically his son-in-law and second cousin, who's holding his hand in this picture. And that is Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And in the Jewish world, many people know him because he led the movement from 1951 to 1994 and created this powerhouse of within the Jewish community, especially in America. In fact, they're labeled basically the Mormons of the Jewish world. They go out and have Chabad houses everywhere. They proselytize for Jews to become more Jewish, and they are very well known in the Jewish world. Without this rescue action, this whole movement would have died because both those men would have been killed. Joseph Isaac Schneerson was stuck in Warsaw, and his son-in-law and second cousin, who I showed you, married his daughter, was stuck in Vichy, France. And so this is also a fascinating story. I wrote a book about it, as you showed, The Rabbi Saved by Hitler Soldiers,
Yep.
for those who are interested in looking at that Tom Clancy-esque type of story.
I mean, it is, again, these stories are just, there's so many different facets of them, and the complexity just shines through, and that's what's so extraordinary about this show we're doing tonight, is that it's just kind of blowing people's minds, I think, about how complex this situation is. And we like to put people into boxes, and the Nazis are bad, and there's so many facets to this story. So yeah, another person some of our viewers will have heard of. I mean, this is another rather famous German. So again, Jewish.
Yeah, and by Jewish law, he's considered a Jew. His mother's mother was Jewish. And Bernhard Rogge was also, like Wilberg, a very humane man, a very good brother, a very good son, an incredible officer. He holds the record in modern warfare of staying at sea longer than anybody else without having to refuel at a port. 655 days, as you see there. He sank more tonnage, 150,000 metric tons of Allied shipping he either captured or sank, which is more tonnage than the Graf Spee, the Deutschland, the Bismarck, Gneisenau, and Tirpitz combined. He basically, you see, he has the Oakleys and the to his Knight's Cross. He basically had the equivalent of 2 medals of honor, or 2 Victorian crosses. And he was a brilliant leader of how to keep his men together, unified. He was very good about knowing their names, their birth dates, where they came from. He hated Hitler, but he loved Germany, and he served World War I bravely. He was at the Battle of Jutland. While he was deployed on the Atlantis, these Hilfskreuzers, or these auxiliary cruisers, and just for people who don't know what that ship is that is being displayed, Germany knew it couldn't go toe-to-toe with the British Navy. Nobody could really, in 39 and 40. What the Germans invented, really from World War I, because they also couldn't go toe-to-toe with the British in World War I, is they created these auxiliary cruisers. So they would transform merchant marine ships to be man-of-war ships, but they would masquerade around like merchant marine ships. And when they get close to enemy ship, they would drop their hidden doors, revealing their cannons, and tell the enemy, either surrender or you'll blow you out of the water. So Rogge captured or sank almost 24 enemy warships for a combined total, what I told you, 150,000 metric tons. And he was brilliant at doing this. Now, while he's being deployed, Paul, he was married to a Jewish woman. He was a quarter Jew. He had been Aryanized by Hitler. They called him the Deutschblutigkeitserklärungen, the German blood declarations that Hitler actually would sign, giving these people the kosher stamp of approval in an official document saying that they could describe themselves as Aryans in documents in the Third Reich. He got this, was able to remain in the military, was part of the training division of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy at that time. And then when he's deployed, his Jewish mother-in-law and Jewish wife are privileged. They're kind of married, and they have that protection, but they're feeling so much pressure and so much of the persecution, and people are calling them up, calling them horrible things, that while he is serving, they both commit suicide. So when he finally does come home, he comes home to an empty home and to 2 graves. And so you kind of look at this like, why are you serving this nation that just is persecuting you and your wife, and took your beloved wife from you? And so here again, once you're looking at the schizophrenia, these guys are like, hey, I'm serving Germany, and I'm doing nothing different than what I did in World War I. And hopefully we get a new leader and get rid of Hitler. And he hated Hitler, but yet he gave an oath to him. And so you have these, horrible situations going on in many of these men's lives. And this is once again the horrible tragedy of this whole history.
And didn't Carl Donitz in his war crimes trial kind of claim he was friends with him in his, like, in that modern way? But I've got a black friend, and didn't Donitz because, but I've got a Jewish friend. We knew he was Jewish. He was still my chum. So the irony is, some of the senior Nazis then use him as their reason for not being a murderer. I mean, the levels of nuance and just ridiculousness to this are just crazy. I mean, you couldn't make it up, is the old adage, I think, applies to this stuff. And by the way, he's played by Van Heflin in that 1960s movie about the Soviets, with Charles
under the movie's called
Flags.
Under 16 Flags, and I think it came out in 59, 60. You're
like
right.
That,
it's a great film. So thanks for bringing that up, Paul.
So I mean, we've got some more to go. I'm conscious of time, but let's go back and talk about we'll stick with the Navy.
Oh, well, I actually was able to meet Frau Ascher. She was 100 years old when I interviewed her. I love this man dearly. He was a half Jew. I mean, he's named after one of the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, Asher, had a lot of problems because of his Jewish background. He was Aryanized as well. He was the artillery officer on the Graf Spree. So, the almost 50,000 metric tons at the Graf Spree, the pocket battleship that sank, the German pocket battleship that sank all this British shipping. He was responsible for the artillery guys that did all that sinking. He was a phenomenal naval officer, very moral man, loved his son, who I became friends with, was an adoring husband, was very educated. And after the Graf Spree was sunk, off the coast of South America, he made his way back to Germany to continue on serving. And he gets the second officer position on the battleship Bismarck under, Admiral Lutyens. And so he's right there. He's helping coordinate fire on the battleship Hood that was sunk very quickly. And, and when finally, the story of the battleship Bismarck is legend, but very few people know that the second in command of the ship was a guy who was of Jewish descent, son, and families being persecuted back home. He's a half Jew who's been Aryanized by Hitler. And what people also don't know is that his commanding officer, Lutyens, who's in command of this flotilla, I think it was Leipzig and Bismarck, was he himself also afflicted. He had a half Jewish wife and two quarter Jewish sons. And so as the Bismarck is going down, many people claim that Lutyens was this fanatic Nazi because he's yelling in the radio broadcast back to the fatherland, "We're fighting for Hitler. We're never going to give up. We're going to fight until the last shell is fired. They're never going to take us, and we're not going to be sunk." And the whole legend that they scuttled the ship, that it was never really sunk, but that Lutyens giving this really patriotic support of Hitler. You have to kind of step back and realize what was really maybe going through his head. Was he thinking, what, I'm going to die, and I'm now no longer going to be able to protect my half-Jewish wife and my two quarter Jewish sons? What's going to happen to them? Maybe if I come across as a real big supporter of Hitler, maybe this might help them a little bit more. Now, who knows? Maybe he really did believe in everything, and he thought, hey, my kids are Aryanized, which they did get Aryanized, and they're going to be protected by the German law. Or maybe did he think, hey, this might help them out a little bit? So the two guys who were in charge of the Bismarck were affected by this whole racial nonsense as well. And Paul Ascher, I highlight in my book, as you can well imagine.
I mean, it's one of the things when the Holocaust comes up in tours in Normandy, and one of the things I don't like is when clients sort of take this stance that, well, it wouldn't have affected me because I'm not homosexual, I'm not Jewish, I'm not this, I'm not that. And I always say, yeah, but we all come under one of the categories eventually. Everybody could come under the, poetry, political leaders, religious, academics, we all there's a way of if they wanted to, they could find a category for us all in there. I mean, my ancestry is all over the place in Britain and Europe and Western Europe, and that is again the paradox of it all, is that we all would eventually have been swept up in the Holocaust, because we all fall into one of the categories somehow. It depends on classification. It depends on where you draw the parameters for this whole assessment, which is the paradox we're talking about of this quarter Jewishness and half Jewishness and marrying into it and not marrying into it. And I mean,
you bring up a very thing, and you bring up an interesting historical event supporting what you're saying. I mean, the lessons from the Third Reich is that if you see an injustice out there and you do nothing, then don't expect people to help you out when it comes at you. I mean, and so it behooves us as a society to, when we see something that is wrong, to take action. And this is one thing that makes me so irritated at Deutschland, Germany today. They always say never again, but yet when you have genocide with the Yazidis that just happened recently in Syria, or the genocide in Bosnia, or the genocide in Sudan, where are all the German military units saying never again? They're cowards in many respects of going forward. Now, granted, they have the clouds of Nazi Germany still on the horizon, and they don't want to be viewed as militaristic. But on the other side, they need to grow a backbone and get in there like America has done. And we're usually a lot of times late to the party, but we get stuff done now.
That's a complicated thing, because I mean, living in France with my Dutch and Belgian and friends, there's kind of a joke here that when Angela Merkel stands up and says, Germany has a suggestion, is that kind of, we know your suggestions from the past, kind of take it all with it's kind of said in jest, but they are having to balance that legacy of recent history, and they know that, and that's what makes modern politics so interesting. When people say, "Oh, why are you obsessed about the war?" I go, "Well, I'm not obsessed about the war. I'm only obsessed about it in the sense that it's still exactly relevant today. Look at the relationship between Australia and Japan and Germany and France, and look how as soon as England played Germany in the World Cup, out comes the World War II imagery. World War II runs through our stories today just as much as it does the past, and all these complex relations, all these look at the rise of anti-Semitism we have in the world again today. These same things going around. It's cyclic. It follows these trends, and that's why discussing these things and understanding the complexity is so very important. But another subject of your book here.
Yeah. Well, before I get to CPN, I just want to reiterate what you're saying. A lot of people need to know about Pastor Niemöller. And sorry to belabor this point, but I can't emphasize it enough. And I'm so glad you brought it up, Paul. Pastor Niemöller was a World War I U-boat ace, and it was a war hero. And from 1933 to 1935, Pastor Niemöller was actually a Nazi party member. But then he started realizing what was going on. And he eventually started with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They set up the confessional church, was a very small minority of Christians who were not going toward Hitler. I mean, most Christians in Germany supported Adolf Hitler. You have to kind of think to yourself, what was God thinking, letting the Christian nation support Hitler? So Niemöller was asked after the war, because he did survive, like, how did this happen? And to support your point, he said, well, when they came after the Jews, I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't do anything. When they came after the socialists, wasn't socialist, didn't do anything. When they came after the gays, I wasn't gay, I didn't do anything. When they came after me, it was too late. And I think we need to just continue on hammering that point at home, because we're still having these problems. This is why we need to study World War II, because it's also stamped our reality with communist, China, with what happened after World War II there and during World War II. Stuff going on in Russia today, politics and how people relate to each other in Europe and the European Union. It's all an outflow from World War II. Yeah. Now, getting to this story of CPN. CPN was in the Africa Corps. As you see that really bright, shiny badge that he has, he lost a leg in combat. So he got the silver wound badge, basically the equivalent of 3 Purple Hearts. He got the Iron Cross. That's that ribbon in his midsection on his gig line. Iron Cross second class. He was a war hero, horribly wounded. And in 1943, his Jewish grandfather, who was a very well-known doctor, Dr. Sipien, was having a lot of problems, and it was causing the family a lot of problems. And one night he realized, if I still stay alive, I'm going to cause my grandson and my children so many more problems. It would be better if I just die. So he walked into his the bedroom where his grandson was, with only one leg now, after having sacrificed that for the fatherland. And he said a prayer over him. He blessed him. And then he went into the other room and took poison and killed himself, and left a really powerful letter that, if you read it in my book, it will bring tears to your eyes. And it just shows you this horrible situation that these guys were in, and the tragedy that was happening. I mean, Jews were committing suicide all over the place, because of the fear, because of what they were doing to their families. And that a nation like Germany, a nation of Beethoven and Bach and Wittgenstein and Fichte and Nietzsche and Hegel, was doing this is mind-numbing. And it still just infuriates me today that more Germans did not stand up and say, no, we will not have this. But there's many books that have been written why that's the case. The economic turmoil after World War One, the lack of information, the fear, and all that. But still, when you look at this type of story,
I'm with you, Brian. But it's also that the late 1920s, early 30s, it was the perfect storm, in the sense that all the ingredients were in place for Hitler and the Third Reich to happen. It wouldn't have happened 10 years earlier. It maybe wouldn't have happened 10 years later, but everything that happened, the Russian Revolution, the ending of the First World War, economy, industrialization, all these things came into place. And you started to think about pride and what identity and national identity. And it was just, it was going to happen. I think I'm convinced now that it was going to happen, and it couldn't have been stopped. Everything was in place to have it happen, and it almost needed to happen. I'm not saying I wanted it to happen. It just, everything was pushing towards it, and it resulted in this awfully long 6 years of war and millions of deaths. But I don't personally think it could have been avoided. I don't think.
Well, it's interesting. There's historians that go back and forth. I talked to Emil Falkenhayn and Fritz Redlich, and we all three, and many others, hold the same opinion that, there was a lot of problems. There probably would have been another war after World War One. How it happened, splitting Germany in half with the Danzig corridor and so on, and the Versailles Treaty and so on. But it's hard to kind of fathom the Holocaust and all the other destruction without Adolf Hitler. If you don't have Adolf Hitler, you probably don't have this stuff. You got to be very careful with hypothetical history. But it's really, it shows you just how important one man, or woman for that matter, ideas in leadership and control can make in steering history a certain way.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. Well, we've got one more of the slides you prepared that we'll talk about, and then we'll bring it to an end. But it's been fascinating. I've loved all these rabbit holes we've been ventured down and these conversations. It just makes it interesting. But let's finish with Mendelssohn.
Okay, so this guy, Oberbaurat, which basically is the equivalent of a captain, Franz Mendelssohn, in the Navy, was in World War One as well. He was the 3 times great grandson of the famous Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, the father of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And this guy had a lot of problems with his Jewish background, was persecuted an awful lot, but a lot of the fascinating engineering developments on the U-boat, the snorkel, the marked improvements of the torpedoes, a lot of the wolf pack tactics and so on, was influenced by many people. But he was right there in the thick of it all, doing incredible work on designing U-boats and building submarines during World War II. And had a lot of family problems. It's interesting. I got in touch with a couple of the cousins that had done a lot of research. And Franz Mendelssohn was one of over 60 men who were either second or third great-grandsons of Moses Mendelssohn, who were in the German military, 60 of them. So here, one of the greatest German Jewish thinkers to be created by Germany. Because of assimilation, many of them were very German, many of them were very Christian. They didn't have any contact with their Judaism anymore, but yet they carried that proud name. And many of them were half Jews and quarter Jews because there was still a lot of intermarrying going on with the families for many generations. And then suddenly Hitler comes into power, and they have a lot of problems. In fact, this guy, Franz, was able to become a Nazi party member. Now, you have to ask yourself, does the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn join the party because he really believes in Mein Kampf and Hitler, after being raised in that type of environment with that pride of knowing about Moses Mendelssohn? And the answer I came to when I got all the papers and diaries from his two daughters, who I was very close with, is that no, he didn't believe in this nonsense, but he thought this is the only way I'm going to be able to feed my family, stay in the Navy, civil service, to build submarines, to do something I know how to do as an engineer. And then hopefully we'll get rid of Hitler and I'll renounce that party membership, and I'll join a new party that's better. I'll do away with the Democrats and I'll join the Republicans, or I'll go with the Whigs and, instead of the Labor Party. I mean, and so here, once again, it shows you just how things were not black and white in Germany, and that there was a lot of gray, and that, these questions of identity are very important to explore, which my book does. Am I black or am I white? Am I a Jew or am I a Christian? Am I worthy to live, not to live? And then, what categories are important. And I think ultimately it's very important for people to come away from this talk and also reading my research to answer those questions for yourself. What are you? Who are you? Because ultimately, the way you come to define yourself directly reflects how you understand society, history, and more importantly, the way you treat others. And therein lies the wisdom with all this history.
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? Is that how we define ourselves isn't something I think about on a daily basis. I don't know that I think about for months. It only comes to be important when something happens and you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma, or there's some decision, or there's a vote to be made, and you go, okay, so what? Where do my values sit, or where does my tradition? I mean, my parents and my parents' parents are Church of England. I define myself personally as an atheist, but by what they were brought up in, I'm still that. Technically, that's how I was raised. So because I don't have to, atheist is just a statement I make. I can't prove it or not prove it. It's just a classification, and that I nominally give myself. And this idea of Englishness and Britishness, as I said, and European, and with the Brexit idea, it's what I found looking at these stories. I was going to ask you to kind of sum up the experience of talking to these gentlemen, but of course there is no one experience. The variety of ways they survived, the variety of ways they got through these events is so broad, you can't sum it up. It's just, as you said there, to look at these stories, read them, and understand, or try and put yourself in those situations and say, where would my heart and where would my brain tell me to go, and what would be the right thing, and where would the paperwork trail lead as well? That's the other thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can claim one thing and the paper trail says something else as well. So it's very complex.
Yeah, papers were everything in the Third Reich. And so if you didn't have the proper papers, and there were so many checks and balances with courthouses, with churches, with your school, the military, the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the civil service you had to do before the military, the Hitler Youth, the paper trail was, if you were trying to fight against that later on to have a false identity, is very difficult. The one thing you learn from all this, and we're still struggling with it all throughout the world, is that people, come on, we're part of one race, the human race, and until we get to a higher level of consciousness where we realize, pigmentation is just pigmentation. It's a very superficial thing that happened maybe 20,000 years ago with Homo sapiens. It's a very recent development. And until we can start intellectualizing that and believe it, we're going to continue on having problems and killing people because of the way we believe religiously, or because, a person's nose is bigger or flatter, or skin color is darker or lighter. It's nonsense when you look at it from a historical point of view. But it's killed millions and millions of people, and it's going to continue to do so, unfortunately. I'm not optimistic.
I don't see an immediate sight yet, but yeah, I think it will change. We are realizing, I think, gradually the younger generations are all the same. I mean, my two stepdaughters, they don't define themselves in the same way as, because they go to international schools, as French, Belgian, this or straight or gay. It's just they have a name and that they are who they are, and they don't like putting labels on themselves. So I think there is a movement to kind of take things a bit broader. But anyway, that's for another discussion. But anyway, thanks, Bryan, for joining us again. It's about an hour and a half, which is amazing. So it was really interesting to hear about some of these figures you've written about. And as usual, folks, of course, you've got the links below to finding out some of the about Bryan's work and the books and things, and you can find them on Facebook and Twitter and what have you. So in terms of what we've got coming up, I'll say next week, it's nothing for a couple of days. It's our Actors Week. We've got shows on Dirk Bogarde, Kenneth Moore, and Sam Fuller, the American director, coming up. And then, of course, it's Tank Week, and then 2 weeks of female historians coming your way in April. So lots and lots coming up that I'm working on right now. But again, thank you, Bryan, for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Paul.
It's been great. For everybody watching, I will see you all again on World War II TV. This is Paul and Bryan saying good night, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thank you. All the best.